My parents secretly sold my childhood home, but I was still living in it. They say home is where the heart is, but what happens when your own parents rip it out of your chest without a word? My name is Mia, and I'm 24 years old. I've always considered myself a pretty grounded person, someone who appreciates the simple things in life. A good cup of coffee in the morning, the feeling of the sun on my skin, and the quiet comfort of my own little house. It wasn't a mansion, not by a long shot, but it was mine. More than that, it was our house. It was the house I grew up in, the place where every corner held a memory. There was the faint scuff mark on the kitchen door frame where my dad had measured my height every year on my birthday, a fading ladder of pencil marks that chronicled my journey from a pigtailed little girl to the young woman I am today. The backyard still had the slightly lopsided stone path my brother and I had laid one sweltering summer, a project that had ended in a playful mud fight and a stern lecture from our mom about tracking dirt inside. These weren't just features of a building, they were the artifacts of my life, a physical map of my history. So when my parents decided to downsize and move to a smaller condo a couple of towns over a few years ago, it felt like a natural progression. They sold the house to a man named Mr. Henderson, a quiet, pleasant-looking landlord who, through my parents' arrangement, offered me an incredibly low rent to stay. It felt like a blessing, a way to keep my childhood tethered to my present. I could afford to save money, to pursue my passion for freelance graphic design without the crushing weight of exorbitant housing costs. Life was good. It was stable. Or so I thought. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, a crisp, official-looking envelope that stood out from the usual pile of junk mail and bills. My name was typed neatly on the front, no return address. I sliced it open with a kitchen knife, expecting maybe a misdirected piece of mail. But the words that met my eyes sent a jolt of ice through my veins. It was a formal notice to vacate. 30 days. I had 30 days to get out of the only home I had ever truly known. My mind reeled. 30 days? Where was I supposed to go? I immediately tried to call Mr. Henderson, my fingers fumbling with the phone, my heart hammering against my ribs. His number went straight to voicemail. I left a frantic, rambling message, my voice cracking with a panic I couldn't control. I sent a text, then an email. Nothing. The silence that answered me was more terrifying than any confrontation could have been. The next 24 hours were a blur of frantic online searches for apartments, each listing a fresh wave of despair. The rents were astronomical, the spaces small and impersonal. None of them had the scuff marks on the doorframe or the lopsided stone path. None of them felt like home. A knot of anxiety tightened in my stomach, a cold, heavy weight that made it hard to breathe. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was an upheaval, a complete unraveling of the life I had so carefully built. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the living room floor, I knew I couldn't face this alone. I needed my parents. I needed their advice, their comfort, their help. Grabbing my keys and purse, I walked out the door, my feet feeling heavy as lead. I didn't know it then, but the comfort I was seeking was about to be shattered by a truth so devastating it would make the eviction notice feel like a greeting card. The drive to my parents' condo felt longer than ever before. The familiar streets seemed to mock me, each landmark a reminder of the stability I was about to lose. My mind was a storm of questions and fears. Why would Mr. Henderson do this? Was there some kind of clause in the lease I had missed? Had my parents forgotten to tell me something crucial? I clung to the hope that this was all a terrible misunderstanding, a bureaucratic error that could be fixed with a phone call or a signed form. When I finally pulled into their neat, assigned parking spot, I took a deep breath, trying to compose myself before walking in. I didn't want to worry them unnecessarily. My mom opened the door before I could even knock, a bright smile on her face that quickly faded when she saw the look on mine. The moment I stepped inside, the carefully constructed dam of my composure broke. The tears I had been fighting back for hours began to stream down my face as I held up the crumpled eviction notice. My mom's reaction, however, was not what I expected. There was no shock, no immediate outrage on my behalf. Instead, a strange, guarded expression washed over her face. She glanced nervously toward the living room, where my dad was sitting in his recliner, pretending to read a newspaper but not turning a single page. The air in the room grew thick and heavy with an unspoken tension that I couldn't decipher. My mom led me to the couch, her hand patting my back in a gesture that felt more like a preemptive apology than a comfort. She took a shaky breath and began to speak, her voice low and hesitant. She told me they knew. They knew about the sale, about the eviction notice. In fact, they had known for weeks. The words didn't seem to make sense at first, bouncing around in my head like disconnected sounds. I looked from my mom's pained face to my dad's averted gaze, a horrifying realization beginning to dawn. My mom continued, her words tumbling out in a rushed, jumbled confession. They hadn't just sold the house to Mr. Henderson a few years ago. They had retained a small stake in it, a clause that gave them a say in its future. And they had just exercised that right. They had sold their stake, which meant the entire property was now under new ownership. They had sold my home out from under me while I was still living in it. The betrayal was a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. I felt the blood drain from my face, replaced by a hot, rushing anger. How could they? How could they keep this from me, watching me pack my life into boxes, knowing all along that they were the architects of my misery? Just as I was about to unleash a torrent of hurt and fury, my dad finally spoke, his voice gravelly and heavy with a weight I had never heard before. He said there was a reason that would change everything, a reason so complicated and dangerous. I wouldn't believe it. And it all started, he said, with my brother, Daniel. Just hearing his name after so many years was like a ghost walking into the room. We hadn't spoken in 6 years, not since the night he left, slamming the door so hard a picture frame fell off the wall in the hallway. The memory of that night was still sharp and painful, a festering wound in our family's history. I remembered the shouting, the raw sound of my father's voice filled with a mixture of anger and disappointment, the muffled sobs of my mother from the kitchen. Daniel had been involved in something shady and stupid. At the time, all I knew was that he had made a terrible mistake, one that had cost the family a significant amount of money and an even greater amount of pride. He was barely 20, full of arrogance and bad ideas, and he had gotten in over his head. The details were always kept from me, shielded by a wall of adult secrecy that I was never allowed to penetrate. I just knew that after that night, he was gone. A few sparse, awkward texts in the first year were the only contact we had, and then even those stopped. He became a taboo subject, a name we didn't speak, a presence that was defined only by his absence. Now, sitting in my parents' pristine, silent condo, that absence filled the entire room. My dad's words hung in the air, a heavy curtain being pulled back on a past I thought I understood. He explained that Daniel's troubles were far deeper and more dangerous than I had ever imagined. It wasn't just a youthful indiscretion, a get-rich-quick scheme that had gone wrong. He had fallen in with a truly bad crowd, people who dealt in threats and violence, not just bad business deals. The debt he had accrued wasn't just to a bank or a disgruntled business partner. It was to people who didn't believe in forgiveness or second chances. My parents had spent years trying to clean up his mess, draining their savings, taking out loans, and doing everything in their power to keep him safe and keep the rest of us in the dark. They thought they had succeeded. They thought they had paid off the last of his demons and that he had disappeared to start a new life, far away from the wreckage he had left behind. But they were wrong. A few weeks ago, my mom confessed the past had come knocking. Not with a phone call or a letter, but with 2 men who sat in their car across the street for 3 days, a silent, menacing reminder of a debt they thought was long buried. The people Daniel owed money to had found them again, and this time they weren't asking for payment, they were demanding it, in full. The sum was astronomical, a number so large it was laughable, impossible. It was a number designed to break them, and it was. The impossible number hung in the air between us, a specter of pure financial ruin. My mom's hands trembled as she wrapped them around her mug of tea, the ceramic rattling against the saucer. My dad stared at a spot on the carpet, his shoulders slumped under the weight of a burden he had carried alone for far too long. This was the secret they had been hiding. The reason for the strange tension and the nervous glances. It wasn't just about a house, it was about survival. The plan, as my dad laid it out, was born out of pure desperation. They had no savings left, no assets to liquidate, except for one, their small remaining stake in my childhood home. It was the only thing of value they had left to sell, the only chip they had left to play. Selling it was the only way to get the large sum of cash they needed, and fast. They couldn't go to a bank. They didn't have time for a traditional sale. They needed a buyer who could close quickly, no questions asked. They found one. The sale was fast, quiet, and final. The money was wired, the debt was paid, and the threat, they hoped, was neutralized. The story they told me about Mr. Henderson being a nice landlord was a half-truth. He was, but he was also a facilitator in their initial plan, a way to keep the house in the family's orbit. But this new sale was different. This was a clean break. As I listened, the anger I felt began to curdle into a strange, sickening mix of pity and horror. I was still angry, furious that they had made this decision without me, that they had let me believe my life was stable while they were dismantling it behind my back. But I was no longer just the victim of a betrayal. I was a casualty of a war I never even knew was being fought. They explained their reasoning for the secrecy with a logic that was both heartbreaking and infuriating. They knew I would have tried to help. They knew I would have offered them my savings, which was laughably small in comparison to what they needed. They feared I would have tried to reason with the loan sharks, a move they believed would have put me in direct danger. They saw it as an act of protection, a shield they had thrown themselves in front of to keep me from getting hit by the shrapnel. It was better, they thought, to deal with the ugly truth themselves and then face my anger later, than to risk my safety. It was a parent's desperate, flawed logic. My dad reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper, placing it on the coffee table in front of me. He told me it was the contact information for the new owner. He said that while the sale was final, there might be a way to fix this, a chance to undo the damage. But it wouldn't be easy. It would require me to step out of the sheltered life I had been living and face the complicated, painful legacy of my family's past head-on. I drove back to my house, the little house that was no longer mine, with the folded piece of paper burning a hole in my pocket. The streetlights cast long, eerie shadows as I pulled into the driveway. The house looked the same as it always had, but now it felt like a stranger's home, a place I was trespassing in. Every memory felt tainted, colored by the knowledge of the desperate bargain that had been made for it. I sat in the car for a long time, the engine off, just staring at the front door. The anger was still there, a simmering resentment at being kept in the dark, at being treated like a child who needed to be protected from the big bad world. But beneath it was a new, unwelcome emotion, a profound sense of responsibility. My dad's words echoed in my mind. A chance to fix this. What did that even mean? The sale was final. The money was gone. With a deep, shuddering breath, I finally got out of the car and went inside. The half-packed boxes scattered around the living room seemed to mock me, monuments to a future that had been stolen. I sat on the couch, the same couch where I'd watched countless movies and cried over a few broken hearts, and slowly unfolded the piece of paper. There was just a name and a phone number written in my dad's neat, familiar script. The name meant nothing to me. It wasn't a corporation or a real estate company, it was just a name, a man's name. I pulled out my laptop, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, a strange sense of dread and curiosity warring within me. I typed the name into the search bar, my heart pounding with a rhythm that felt both too fast and too slow. The search results loaded, and I clicked on the first link. It was a website for a charitable foundation. The name was at the top, followed by the words founder and president. There was a picture of an elderly man with kind eyes and a sad smile. But it was the name of the foundation that made my blood run cold. It was named after a boy I hadn't thought about in years, a boy who had been a peripheral part of Daniel's life, a name linked to the original incident that had sent my brother running all those years ago. The coincidence was too much. It had to be connected. My hands trembled as I found the foundation's contact information and typed out a short, hesitant email explaining who I was and asking for a meeting. I hit send before I could talk myself out of it, a sense of surrealism washing over me. I was contacting the new owner of my home, the man who had unknowingly bought my family out of a crisis, a man whose past was inexplicably linked to my own. An hour later, a reply came. The meeting was set for the next day, at the house. I spent a sleepless night surrounded by the ghosts of my memories, the packing boxes looming in the darkness like tombstones. The next morning, I watched from the window as a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. An elderly, well-dressed man stepped out, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked up at the house, his gaze sweeping over the facade, and for a moment his expression was one of profound, familiar sadness. He walked to the front door and knocked, the sound echoing through the silent house. I took one last deep breath and opened the door, my heart in my throat. He introduced himself, and the name he spoke, the same name from the website, hit me like a physical blow. He was the father of the boy who was at the center of the storm that had destroyed my brother's life. The man, Mr. Sterling, stood in my doorway, his presence filling the small entryway with an unspoken history. He didn't look like a villain or a savior. He just looked like a man who had carried a great weight for a very long time. He asked if he could come in, and I nodded, leading him into the living room, the same room where I had learned my family's terrible secret just a day before. We sat in the same chairs, the air thick with the ghosts of two different but connected tragedies. He began to speak, his voice quiet but clear, and as he talked, the final missing pieces of the puzzle slid into place with a horrifying, heartbreaking clarity. The incident all those years ago, the one that had driven my brother away, it wasn't just a simple business deal gone wrong. It was a partnership, a startup venture between my brother, Daniel, and his son, Robert. They were young, brilliant, and arrogant, and they had an idea that they believed would change the world.
But they were also naive. They were taken advantage of by a larger, more ruthless company, a corporate shark that bled them dry and left them with nothing but massive debts and shattered dreams. For my brother, it was a humiliating blow to his pride. But for Mr. Sterling's son, Robert, it was a death sentence. Robert had a congenital heart condition, a fragile system that couldn't handle the immense stress and failure. The financial ruin and the public collapse of their dream triggered a fatal cardiac event. He was dead within a month of the company's implosion. Mr. Sterling's voice cracked with emotion as he spoke of his son, the pain of his loss still raw and palpable after all these years. He explained that for a long time he had blamed my brother entirely. He saw Daniel as the reckless architect of his son's demise. But then, a few years after Robert's death, he began to learn more about the circumstances. He discovered the full extent of the corporate sabotage, the way the two young men had been manipulated and deceived. He learned that Daniel was just as much a victim as his son had been. And then, something incredible happened. Daniel contacted him. It was a clumsy, guilt-ridden letter, full of apologies and a desperate desire to make amends. That single letter began a long, slow, tentative correspondence. Daniel had been living a quiet, ascetic life, working menial jobs and sending every spare dollar he had to Mr. Sterling, trying to repay a debt he knew could never truly be repaid. Mr. Sterling saw in my brother not a villain, but a young man broken by guilt, trying to find a path to redemption. He eventually refused the money and instead offered him a job working for his charitable foundation, a way for Daniel to channel his desire to atone into something positive. The story Mr. Sterling told was so incredible, so layered with irony and redemption that it felt like something out of a movie. He explained that the sale of my house was never a sale at all. A few months ago, Daniel had confessed to him that the old loan sharks, the ones from his early, reckless youth, had resurfaced. They had tracked down his parents and were threatening them. Daniel was distraught, consumed by the idea that the mistakes of his past were once again endangering his family. Mr. Sterling saw a way to help, a way to finally bring this long, tragic story to a close. But he knew my family. He knew their pride, and he knew Daniel's. He couldn't just write them a check. They would never accept it. So he devised a plan, a charade really. He would buy the house from my parents. But the price he paid was vastly inflated, a number calculated to be exactly the amount needed to pay off the dangerous debt, with enough left over for my parents to have a small cushion. The transaction was structured to look like a legitimate real estate deal, a clean, impersonal business exchange. The money was funneled through the sale, a financial sleight of hand designed to save my family's honor while saving their lives. The eviction notice I had received, the one that had thrown my world into chaos,
was just part of the act, a necessary detail to make the sale seem real and final. Mr. Sterling looked at me, his kind eyes filled with a deep, sincere regret for the pain his plan had caused me personally. He explained that they had all been so focused on the bigger picture, on saving my parents from harm, that they hadn't fully considered the devastating impact it would have on me. He assured me that the house was truly mine. He had no intention of taking it from me. The deed, once all the legal formalities were cleared, would be transferred into my name, free and clear. It was a gift, not just of a house, but of a fresh start from my entire family. But there was one last condition, one final piece of this complex puzzle that had to be put in place. He said it wasn't his condition, but Daniel's. It was the one thing my brother felt he needed to do to truly begin to heal, to close the circle of pain and guilt that had defined his life for so long. The condition, he said, was for me. It was something only I could do. Mr. Sterling's final words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The condition was for me. My mind raced, trying to guess what he could possibly ask of me. After everything, what more could there be? He explained that for all these years, Daniel had been living in a self-imposed exile, a prison of his own making. He worked for the foundation, he helped people, he was building a new life, but he was still alone, cut off from the one thing he desperately missed, his family. The guilt was a wall he couldn't break through on his own. He was too ashamed to call, too afraid of the rejection he felt he deserved. Mr. Sterling believed that the only way for Daniel to truly be free was for that wall to come down. The condition was simple yet profound. I had to be the one to tear it down. I had to call my brother. Mr. Sterling reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a simple business card, writing a phone number on the back. He said Daniel was expecting my call, that he was terrified, but that he was ready. He told me that forgiveness wasn't just about absolving someone of their sins, it was about setting them free from the prison they've built around themselves. And in doing so, setting myself free too. I took the card, my hand trembling so violently I could barely hold it. The anger, the betrayal, the confusion, it all melted away, replaced by a wave of overwhelming empathy for the brother I had lost, and a deep, aching love for the parents who had sacrificed everything to protect me. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, the eviction notice and the packing boxes forgotten. I sat in the quiet of the house that was truly mine, and just stared at the number on the card. It represented 6 years of silence, of unanswered questions, of a void in my life I had learned to live with. That evening, as the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow through the windows, I knew it was time. I went into my bedroom, closed the door, and took a deep breath. With a heart that felt like it was about to beat out of my chest, I dialed the number. It rang once, twice, then a voice, hesitant and rough with disuse, answered. It was a voice I hadn't heard in 6 years, a voice filled with a lifetime of regret and a fragile, flickering spark of hope. The conversation that followed was the most difficult and the most cathartic of my entire life. There were tears and long, heavy silences and years of unspoken words that finally found their voice. We talked about the past, about the pain, about the stupid mistakes and the desperate attempts to atone. We didn't solve everything in that one phone call, but we started. We opened a door that had been closed for far too long. Weeks later, I was unpacking boxes, but this time it was different. The boxes weren't being packed to leave, they were being unpacked to stay. And I wasn't alone. My brother was there, in the living room, helping my dad hang a picture on the wall. The air was clear, the silence no longer heavy with unspoken secrets, but comfortable and warm. The house was no longer a symbol of betrayal, but a testament to our family's messy, complicated, and unbreakable bond. It was our childhood home, and it was finally, truly a home again.